The 1986 anime film Project A-ko is a wild action comedy science fiction romp that mashes together many different concepts and visual ideas, following the high-spirited teenage schoolgirl Eiko as she battles her rival Biko, hangs out with her hapless friend Siko, and saves the world from an alien invasion. Directed by Katsuhiko Nishijima and produced by the APPP Company, the film remains one of the most notable anime films from the 1980s. In this video, we'll explore some of the visual and storytelling techniques used in one of the film's scenes. Per usual, there will be spoilers to the story of Project A-ko, so I recommend checking it out before proceeding further. As a general story overview, the film follows Eiko as she navigates high school life with Siko, Biko, and a host of other characters, while an eventual alien invasion becomes the big climactic battle in the latter part of the story. The film was produced during a time when a lot of the animation and visual elements were hand-drawn instead of extensive computer-generated elements, so there's a warmth to the drawings and movement that is very welcoming. In the scene we'll examine, Eiko battles a series of giant mecha robots while confronting her rival, Biko. Shot number 1 of the scene gives us the staging of many of the visual elements, also indicating the scale and size difference between Eiko and the giant mechs. The camera lens and composition is wide enough to show the general orientation of these characters, so we know where they are staged. The camera is tilted, creating a slight Dutch angle, and there's smoke in the foreground. As the mechs are likely hand-drawn, there's still a warmth and organic feel to the way they are constructed, enhanced by the visual rhythm of their round shapes. We see large, medium, and smaller round shapes used in constructing their bodies, heads, and limbs. In shot number 2 of the scene, we see Eiko rising in the air toward one of the mechs. The background is made more abstract by a new layer of action lines, creating a dynamic feeling to the scene. The warm tones of the reds and yellows in the mech also reflect the warm reds in Eiko's hair. This shot also helps us to see a closer view of how Eiko's size matches up with the mech when she is closer to one of them. This size comparison helps us to better understand how Eiko will move around the mech when the fight begins. In shot number 3 of the scene, Eiko launches into her attack on the mech. The background action lines are now running vertically to the scene, which is different from the diagonal lines from the previous shot. As we continue with this shot, Eiko grabs onto the mech's arm and swings around to make a kick. Then she leaps away from the falling mech and toward the camera as the explosion happens behind her. The camera then banana pans with her toward another mech, and she launches into a kick into it. The background action lines have also gone horizontal in orientation. Eiko actually moves away from the camera, going deeper into the spatial depth as she kicks into the mech at the end of this shot. In shot number 4, we see an upshot of the mech with Eiko in the foreground. The sky plane above the mech is clearly visible, helping us to see the orientation of all the visual elements. The warm reds of the mech also align with Eiko's red hair, and this contrasts with the colder blue tones of the sky. Due to the round shapes of the mech, our eyes travel upward in these rounder visual rhythms rather than straight perspective lines. This creates a more playful sense to the visual elements in the frame. In shot number 5, we see a downshot on Eiko as she reacts to the mech about to attack her. The ground plane is visible, and the ominous tone of the impending mech attack is conveyed by Eiko, mostly being in shadow. In shot number 6, the camera pulls back out and wider to show the mech punching the ground, but Eiko has narrowly escaped and flies upward into the air. The mech takes up most of the frame, filling the space. Debris and dust clouds are animated on the bottom screen left to show where the mech's fists made impact with the ground, and seeing Eiko in midair helps to set up the next set of actions that she's going to launch into against the mech. In shot number 7, we see Eiko following through on her next set of actions against the mech as she leaps over its head and grasps the antenna at the top. The camera cuts in tighter on the area around the mech's head, so we can clearly read the action of Eiko's movements without any confusion. In shot number 8, the camera resets and is staged closer to the ground as Eiko lands on her feet, now carrying the mech by holding its head in her hands. The shot is also setting up the next flow of action by showcasing the blue mech in the background, which will become the target of Eiko's attack. The camera swings around to show Eiko's expression as she yells and throws the red mech. In shot number 9, the camera cuts behind her in a wider angle where we see the result of her throw, tossing the red mech into the blue mech. There's part of the set in the foreground that frames the action. We need the camera angle to be wide enough to see the explosion as the mechs collide so we can read it clearly. In shot number 10, the camera cuts to a downshot on Biko, who is witnessing the resulting explosion of the colliding mechs. The painterly strokes of the ground plane help to create perspective cues within the shot. In shot number 11, the camera cuts in closer on a medium close-up of Biko and a down shot so we can see her reaction and facial expression to the explosion. Once again, the painterly strokes for the shadows on the ground help to create perspective cues for the ground plane. In shot number 12, we see what might be Biko's point of view, showing the rising smoke from the mech collision fills the entire frame, giving us a sense of the enormity of the event. Darker reds, oranges, and yellows, along with some black tones, are used to shape the contours and volumes of the smoke. In shot number 13, we see an upshot on Biko on a slightly wider medium close-up, or what is sometimes called a 2T shot. The sky plane is visible along with some of the trees and school buildings in the background. The focus of the shot remains on Biko's facial expressions and allows for enough space within the frame as she will turn her head and react to Eiko, calling at her from off-screen. In shot number 14, we see a reverse angle from Biko, with the camera now focused on Eiko and Seiko on the other side of the school fence. Both girls are seen in full-body poses, although Seiko's legs are slightly hidden by the case she is carrying. This shot helps us set a pause in the action after the more dynamic shots and action beats we saw earlier. It allows Eiko to deliver some dialogue to Biko, setting up the next series of story beats. In shot 15, we cut back to Biko with the bottom of the frame probably a little above her knees. The background behind her is filled with the fiery smoke, creating a dramatic backdrop to Biko as she responds to Eiko with anger. This also heightens the sense of tension between them for the next story beats. Another area that we can look at for this scene is breaking down specific poses for the characters to see how the animation is constructed. For example, in this shot, we see Eiko in midair, then she tucks her legs in to anticipate the kick. Then she launches into the kick and it makes impact, and then she flips backward as a recoil effect. Breaking down the specific key poses helps to see what drawings are needed to communicate the action fluidly and clearly. We can also see the use of impact frames at the moment Eiko's legs make impact with the mech's head. In one impact frame, Eiko is lit from underneath, while the mech is mostly lit from the top, creating an alternating pattern in the lighting and contrast. Then in another impact frame, Eiko is clearly seen in full colors, while the mech is barely seen except for its brighter highlights against a black backdrop. These impact frames are so fast, but when played at 24 frames a second, they create a visual sensation to highlight Eiko's kick impact. In poses 10 through 13, we see Eiko leaping away from the falling mech, but these poses also highlight her comedic facial expression, reacting to the explosion behind her without turning her head to look at it. It's a warm and funny touch to the action that also highlights a bit of Eiko's personality. Even the way that her knees are turned inward toward each other in pose number 13 creates a funny visual beat. In poses 14 through 19, we see the downshot of Eiko as she reacts to the mech's incoming fist. There are a series of funny facial expressions that pop on screen quickly as we cycle through these poses, including humorous comic thought bubbles. We can see playful variations on eye and mouth expressions on Eiko's face. Apparently, the animators were encouraged to put their own personal touches in these animated poses, which adds to the warmth of the drawings. Finally, another area that we can quickly look at is breaking down some of the effects and impact frames. In FX 1 through 5, we see Eiko swinging along the mech's arms and kicking into it. We see a similar use of high contrast in the impact frames that will play very quickly at 24 frames a second. And in FX number 6 to 10, we see an interesting use of concentric circles and strong yellow perspective lines stretching toward the camera as Eiko kicks into the mech. These broad visual elements help to create variation within the action story beats, constantly surprising us with their visual design. So overall, a closer look at this scene from Project Eiko helps us to better understand how a sequence like this can be made for an anime film. As we look back in retrospective on Project Eiko, it reflects aesthetic decisions that added to the growing field of anime, but also offers ideas that could be incorporated into present-day creations.